Sometimes the hardest truths come when you least expect them, carried up from the depths by the one soul who's never let you down. For 60-year-old Elias Crowder, that soul was his dog Boone, and that morning by the river would change everything he thought he knew about family. Living alone in the Montana wilderness for 30 years, Elias had found peace in the silence of the mountains. But when Boone stopped dead at the riverbank, staring into the water with a look Elias had never seen before, that peace shattered. The dog was fixed on something big, a thick iron chain disappearing into the muddy water. Boone barked once, low and certain, like he was telling his master to trust him one more time. So Elias grabbed that chain and pulled. What came up from those depths was an iron vault, rusted but intact, with markings that made his blood run cold. They were the same markings his brother Samuel had carved into everything he owned before he vanished 30 years ago. What had Samuel hidden in that river, and why was it surfacing now? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fire crackled and settled, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind howled its ancient song of change and challenge. And on the table, Samuel's vault waited with the patience of the dead, holding its secrets like a promise or a threat. The vault sat between them like a bridge between past and present, between the man Elias had been and whatever he might become. Inside that rusted container lay answers to questions that had haunted him for 30 years. But answers, Elias had learned, didn't always bring peace. Sometimes they just traded old pain for new understanding. And understanding could be the heaviest burden of all. Boone's tail thumped once against the floor, not the enthusiastic wagging of excitement, but the slow, deliberate response of a creature who'd been waiting 3 decades for this conversation. "What do you think, old boy?" Elias asked softly. "Should I leave the past buried or dig it up and see what kind of bones we find?" Boone raised his head again, looking directly at his master with those deep brown eyes that seemed to hold more understanding than any dog had a right to possess. The old hound had been with Samuel when whatever happened happened. If anyone knew the truth, it was the dog stretched out by the fire, grey around the muzzle, but still sharp as a blade when it mattered. But first, he had to decide what to do about the vault. He could bury it, pretend Boone had never led him to that chain, go back to his quiet routine of chopping wood and reading books and waiting for spring. Or he could open it and finally learn what his brother had died trying to protect. Outside, the storm was building toward something serious. Snow was falling now, the first real accumulation of the season, and the temperature was dropping fast. Up here at 8,000 feet, October snow usually meant business. Elias would need to bring in more firewood soon, check the generator, make sure the cabin was ready for what could be a long, hard winter. Elias set the knife beside the vault and studied them together. The metal container was maybe the size of a cigar box, heavy enough to sink but sealed tight against 30 years of river water. Whatever Samuel had put inside, he'd meant for it to stay hidden. The question was whether Elias had the right to disturb his brother's final secret, or the courage to face whatever truth lay waiting in that rusty tomb. The knife felt warm in Elias's palm, familiar as his own heartbeat. How many times had he watched Samuel use it to dress a deer, whittle kindling, or simply clean his fingernails while thinking through a problem? The bone handle bore the same 3 circles and cross that marked the vault, carved when Samuel was maybe 16 and still believing the world owed him adventures. Elias reached across the table and picked up Samuel's hunting knife, sliding it from its worn leather sheath. The blade still held an edge that could split a hair, the steel darkened with age but free of rust. Samuel had been particular about his tools, insisting that a man's character showed in how he cared for the things that kept him alive. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Boone lifted his head, ears pricked, then settled back down with a soft woof. Even after all these years, certain sounds could set the old dog on alert, as if he was still listening for his first master's footstep on the porch. Martha still sent him a Christmas card every year, always with a note asking if he needed anything. She was the only one who remembered that Samuel's birthday was coming up, would have been his 59th this December. Martha Henley was about the only person who still treated him like family. She'd been Samuel's girlfriend for 2 years before he disappeared, a pretty schoolteacher with dreams of marriage and babies. She'd waited a full year before accepting that Samuel wasn't coming back, then married a good man from Kalispell and raised 3 fine children. Now she taught 4th grade and ran the Historical Society, preserving the stories of people like the Crowders in neat folders and careful handwriting. Elias rarely went to town anymore, maybe once a month for supplies and to check his mail at the post office. People knew him by sight, but kept their distance, respecting the invisible barrier that surrounded men who'd lost too much. The younger folks probably thought he was just another crazy mountain man, while the older residents remembered the Crowder brothers and understood why Elias chose solitude over sympathy. Cedar Falls had changed plenty in 30 years. The sawmill had closed in the late 90s, replaced by a tourism economy that brought city folks up to play at being mountain men for a week or two. The town had grown from 800 souls to nearly 3,000, most of them retirees who'd discovered Montana's beauty and decided to buy a piece of it. New restaurants, gift shops, even a fancy hotel with a spa, all of it built on the idea that the wilderness was something safe and manageable. A theme park with really good scenery. The guilt had eaten at him like acid for years. He'd quit his job with the Forest Service, couldn't stand the thought of managing the same wilderness that had swallowed his brother whole. Instead, he'd moved permanently to the cabin, living off his savings and the small pension their father had left them. He'd become what the folks in town called a hermit, though he preferred to think of himself as a guardian, watching over the mountains that held Samuel's bones. Elias had blamed himself from the start. He should have insisted on going along, should have pressed harder when Samuel refused to explain his secretive behavior, should have recognized the signs of a man carrying a dangerous burden. Instead, he'd let his younger brother walk alone into whatever trouble had been chasing him. The search had lasted 3 weeks. Sheriff Bradley, Tom's father, had organized teams of volunteers to comb every trail, every ridge, every creek bed within 50 miles. They'd found Samuel's truck parked at the Bitter Creek trailhead, keys still in the ignition, that canvas pack nowhere to be found. His rifle was still in the gun rack, his hunting license tucked into the visor. It was like he'd simply walked into the wilderness and dissolved into the morning mist. Different. Samuel had gotten that right, though not in any way either of them could have imagined. That last morning, Elias closed his eyes and let the memory surface, painful as probing a rotten tooth. Samuel had been excited about something, pacing around the cabin like a caged cougar, talking about finally making things right. He'd been carrying a canvas pack stuffed full of papers and what looked like rock samples. When Elias asked where he was headed, Samuel had just grinned that lopsided grin and said, "Trust me, brother. After today, everything's going to be different." The markings on the vault weren't just Samuel's signature. They were carved with Samuel's hunting knife. Elias knew, because that knife sat in the drawer not 3 feet away, its bone handle worn smooth by his brother's thumb. He'd kept it all these years, along with Samuel's clothes, his books, even his coffee mug with the chip on the rim from when he'd dropped it that last morning. Elias lit his pipe, the cherry tobacco mixing with the wood smoke already heavy in the air. The ritual calmed him, gave his hands something to do while his mind wrestled with impossibilities. He'd pulled that vault from the Clearwater River at first light, following Boone's urgent insistence. The dog had known something was down there, had acted like he'd been waiting 30 years for this moment. The cabin itself held memories in every shadow. Built by their father in 1962, it had served as a base camp for the Crowder family's hunting and fishing expeditions. After their parents died in that car wreck down on Highway 2, the brothers had used it as a retreat from their jobs in town. Samuel from his work at the sawmill, Elias from his position at the Forest Service. They'd come up here to drink beer, tell stories, and pretend they weren't two men pushing 40 who still felt like lost boys. Boone lay by the fireplace, his grey muzzle resting on his paws, watching his master with the patient devotion that only comes from a lifetime of shared silence. The old hound had been Samuel's dog first, barely 2 years old when his original master vanished into these mountains on what should have been a routine hunting trip. For months after, Boone had waited by the cabin door, whimpering at every wind sound, every crack of settling timber. When Elias finally accepted that his brother wasn't coming home, Boone had transferred his loyalty with the quiet dignity of a creature who understood loss better than most humans. But Samuel Crowder had been dead, or at least missing and presumed dead, for 30 years come next. Spring, Elias ran his weathered fingers along the vault's surface, tracing the familiar pattern carved deep into the metal. 3 interlocking circles with a cross at the center, Samuel's mark. His younger brother had carved that symbol into everything he owned. His hunting knife, his rifle stock, even the wooden cross that marked their parents' graves down in Cedar Falls Cemetery. It was Samuel's way of claiming ownership, of saying, "This belongs to the Crowder boys." The iron vault sat on Elias Crowder's kitchen table like a judgment, water still dripping from its edges onto the worn pine boards his grandfather had cut from these very mountains. Outside, the October wind whistled through the gaps in the log cabin's chinking, a sound that had lulled him to sleep for 3 decades. But tonight, sleep felt as distant as the stars hidden behind the storm clouds gathering over the continental divide. The vault opened with a sound like breaking bones, the rusted hinges protesting after 3 decades underwater. Elias had waited until morning, until the storm passed and weak sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, before finally working up the courage to pry the thing open with Samuel's own hunting knife. The irony wasn't lost on him, using his brother's blade to unlock his brother's secrets. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that had kept the contents dry as desert bones, lay the pieces of a puzzle that made Elias's blood run cold. First was Samuel's journal, a leather-bound notebook their mother had given him for his 20th birthday. Elias recognized it immediately. Samuel had carried that journal everywhere, scribbling notes about hunting spots, weather patterns, and the 1,000 small observations that filled a woodsman's days. But the entries from the last few weeks of Samuel's life read like the desperate writings of a man running out of time. "They're getting closer," read one entry dated just 3 days before Samuel disappeared. "Found tire tracks at the old Meridian claim again, fresh ones. They're not giving up, and neither can I." Another entry, written in Samuel's increasingly shaky handwriting. "If something happens to me, the cache at Devil's Backbone holds everything. He will know what to do. He always was the smart one." But it was the map fragment that made Elias's hands tremble. Torn from a larger topographical map, it showed a section of the Bitterroot Mountains about 20 miles north of the cabin. Samuel had marked 3 locations with his careful X's, each one labeled with cryptic notations: Cache 1, samples; Cache 2, documents; and main site, God help us all. The handwriting was definitely Samuel's, but the fear bleeding through the ink was something Elias had never seen from his brother. Samuel Crowder had been afraid of exactly nothing, not bears, not storms, not the kind of men who settled disputes with fists and fury. To see that fear preserved in careful pencil strokes was like discovering that gravity might suddenly decide to work sideways. Beneath the journal and map lay a collection of items that told a story Elias wished he didn't have to hear. Rock samples, chunks of quartz shot through with gold veins that even an amateur could recognize as valuable. Photographs of men Elias didn't recognize, hard-faced individuals standing around mining equipment that looked too sophisticated for any legitimate operation. And most disturbing of all, a letter addressed to the FBI field office in Helena, never sent, describing what Samuel called an ongoing criminal enterprise that has resulted in multiple deaths and the systematic looting of protected federal lands. The letter was dated 2 days before Samuel's disappearance. He'd never had the chance to mail it. Elias set everything on the table and studied the collection like a detective examining evidence, which he supposed was exactly what he was doing. Samuel hadn't just vanished, he'd been silenced. And now, 30 years later, his big brother was holding the proof. The journal entries painted a picture of gradual discovery and growing terror. Samuel had stumbled across something while hunting: illegal mining activity on federal land, probably in the old Meridian claim area that had been abandoned since the 1940s. Instead of reporting it immediately, Samuel had decided to investigate on his own. Probably thinking he needed more evidence to make a case stick, that decision had cost him his life. The photographs showed the same group of men at different times and locations, always with expensive equipment, and the kind of organization that suggested serious money behind the operation. Some of the faces looked familiar in the way that people from small towns always looked familiar, but Elias couldn't place specific names. These weren't random prospectors panning for pocket change. This was industrial-scale theft disguised as legitimate business. One photograph made Elias's stomach clench. It showed Samuel himself, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, crouched behind a fallen log and photographing the mining operation. Someone had been watching the watcher, documenting Samuel's documentation. They'd known he was onto them, which meant they'd had time to plan his elimination. Boone padded over to the table and sniffed at the opened vault, his hackles rising slightly. The old dog's instincts were still sharp enough to smell danger, even danger that was 3 decades old. "You remember this, don't you, boy?" Elias asked softly. "You were there when it happened." The dog whined low in his throat and backed away from the table, confirming what Elias had already begun to suspect. Boone had been with Samuel on that final trip. Somehow the dog had survived whatever killed his master and made his way back to the cabin, carrying the trauma in his canine memory like a wound that never quite healed. Elias picked up the map fragment and studied Samuel's careful notations. 3 cache sites, each one presumably containing different pieces of the evidence Samuel had gathered. The main site, marked with that ominous "God help us all," was probably where the actual mining was taking place. If Samuel's body was anywhere, it would be there. The smart thing would be to take everything to Sheriff Bradley and let the law handle it. But Elias knew small-town politics well enough to understand the complications. 30 years was a long time, long enough for guilty parties to establish themselves in the community, to build legitimate businesses on illegitimate foundations. The men in those photographs might be pillars of the community by now, their past crimes buried as deep as Samuel's bones. Besides, what crime had actually been committed that could still be prosecuted? Samuel was legally dead, his case officially closed. The mining operation was ancient history, the evidence circumstantial at best. Any decent lawyer could argue that the photographs showed nothing illegal, that the rock samples came from legitimate sources, that Samuel's journal was the paranoid ramblings of a man losing his grip on reality. But Elias knew better. His brother had been many things: stubborn, impulsive, sometimes reckless, but never paranoid, never prone to flights of fantasy. If Samuel said there were bodies buried in those mountains, then there were bodies buried in those mountains. The question was what to do about it. Elias walked to the window and looked out at the wilderness that had defined his life for 30 years. Somewhere out there, probably not 20 miles from where he stood, lay the answers to every question that had kept him awake at night. Samuel's bones, the evidence he'd died trying to preserve, maybe even the identity of the men who'd killed him. The rational part of his mind whispered cautions. He was 60 years old, alone, except for an aging dog, going up against people who'd already committed murder to protect their secrets. The smart play was to let sleeping dogs lie, to bury the vault again, and pretend Boone had never found that chain. But the brother in him, the part that had carried guilt like a stone for 3 decades, knew he couldn't walk away. Not when Samuel had trusted him to know what to do, not when the evidence was sitting right there on his kitchen table, waiting for someone to care enough to act on it. Elias returned to the table and carefully gathered Samuel's effects. wrapping them back in the oiled leather with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. The map fragment he kept separate, spreading it flat beside his morning coffee. 3 locations marked in his dead brother's handwriting. 3 chances to finally learn the truth. "Well, Boone," he said to the dog still cowering by the fireplace, "looks like we're going hunting after all." The old hound lifted his head, ears forward, tail tentatively beginning to wag. Despite his fear, despite 30 years of trying to forget, some part of Boone was ready to finish what his first master had started. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over the mountains, burning off the last of the storm clouds and revealing a world washed clean by snow and possibility. It was the kind of day Samuel would have called perfect for tracking, when the air was sharp enough to carry scent for miles, and every footprint showed clear as writing on a page. Elias folded the map carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, right next to his heart. Samuel had left him a trail to follow, breadcrumbs scattered across 30 years of silence. Whether that trail led to justice or just to more bones buried in unmarked graves remained to be seen. But for the first time since his brother disappeared, Elias Crowder felt like he had a purpose beyond simply surviving another winter in the mountains. Samuel had been trying to make things right when they killed him. Now it was Elias's turn to try. The trail to Devil's Backbone started at an old logging road that most folks had forgotten existed. Elias strapped on his father's ancient pack frame, loaded with enough supplies for 3 days in the backcountry, and checked his .30-06 one more time before slinging it across his shoulder. Beside him, Boone stood alert and ready, his grey muzzle lifted to catch the mountain scents that would guide them through the wilderness. His first master had died trying to navigate. The morning was crisp and clean, the kind of October day that reminded a man why he'd chosen to live in God's country instead of down in the valleys with all the noise and complications of modern life. But as they climbed higher into the bitter roots, following Samuel's carefully marked route, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the mountains themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see if history would repeat itself. 3 miles in, they found the first sign that others had been this way recently. Fresh tire tracks in a muddy patch where the old road crossed Willow Creek, the tread pattern sharp enough to have been made within the last week. Elias knelt beside the tracks, studying the width and depth with the analytical eye of a man who'd spent decades reading the wilderness like a book. Heavy vehicle, probably a pickup truck with oversized tires, the kind of rig that could haul equipment or bodies with equal efficiency. The tracks headed deeper into the mountains, following the same route Samuel had taken 30 years ago. Boone sniffed around the tire marks, hackles rising as some scent triggered memories he'd spent 3 decades trying to forget. The old dog whined softly and pressed close to Elias's leg, seeking comfort in the familiar presence of his second master. "Easy, boy," Elias murmured, scratching behind Boone's ears. "We'll take this slow and careful, not like Samuel did." They pressed on, climbing through stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir that filtered the sunlight into cathedral patterns on the forest floor. The silence was broken only by their footsteps and the occasional call of a jay or squirrel protesting their passage. It was the kind of peace that could fool a man into forgetting there was danger in the world, that sometimes the most beautiful places held the darkest secrets. 4 miles from the trailhead, they found Samuel's first campsite. It was tucked into a natural depression beside a seasonal stream, hidden from casual observation but positioned to offer clear sightlines down the mountain. Samuel had chosen the spot well, close enough to water for convenience, far enough from the main trail to avoid detection. The remains of his fire ring were still visible, stones blackened by flames that had burned 30 years ago. Elias poked through the cold ashes with a stick, uncovering fragments that told a story of hasty departure. A bent fork probably dropped in darkness. Scraps of paper too burned to read, but clearly from Samuel's journal pages. And buried beneath it all, something that made Elias's heart race, Samuel's compass. The brass case was tarnished black, and a bullet hole punched clean through the center. But the needle still swung true to magnetic north. Samuel had never gone anywhere without that compass. It had been their grandfather's, carried through 2 wars and countless hunting expeditions. Finding it here, damaged but not destroyed, was like discovering a piece of Samuel's soul still clinging to these mountains. Elias turned the compass over in his hands, feeling the weight of family history and violent interruption. The bullet hole was precise, centered, the kind of shot that suggested either incredible luck or professional skill. Samuel had been carrying this compass when someone tried to kill him. The fact that it was here, abandoned with the campsite, meant Samuel had escaped that first attempt on his life, but not the last one. Boone found the next clue, nosing around a fallen log that had sheltered Samuel's sleeping area. Buried beneath 30 years of pine needles and forest debris was a small canvas bag, wrapped in the same oiled leather that had protected the contents of the river vault. Inside were more rock samples, these ones clearly from a different location, and a note in Samuel's careful handwriting. Cache 1. Samples confirm industrial operation. Moving to higher ground. B remembers the way. B for Boone. Samuel had been counting on his dog to remember the route, to serve as a guide if something happened to his master. The old hound had kept that knowledge locked away for 3 decades. Waiting for someone to ask the right questions, Elias studied the map fragment again, comparing Samuel's markings to the terrain around them. Cache 2 was another 5 miles up the mountain, near a place marked on the topographical maps as Lookout Ridge. Samuel had been working his way systematically toward the main site, gathering evidence at each stop like a prosecutor building a case. The problem was that someone had been following him, tracking his progress with the patience of professional hunters. The bullet hole in the compass suggested they'd tried to end his investigation at this very campsite. When that failed, they'd been forced to let him continue deeper into the wilderness, where a body could disappear forever and awkward questions would eventually stop being asked. They broke camp at midday, following a game trail that switchbacked up the mountainside through increasingly dense timber. The elevation gain was brutal for a 60-year-old man carrying a full pack, but Elias pushed through the burning in his legs and lungs, driven by 30 years of unanswered questions and the growing certainty that Samuel's death had been both inevitable and preventable. If only he'd insisted on coming along. If only he'd pressed harder when Samuel refused to explain his secretive behavior. If only he'd been the kind of brother who wouldn't let family walk into danger alone. The trail leveled out as they approached Lookout Ridge, and Elias called a halt to catch his breath and study the terrain ahead. Through breaks in the forest canopy, he could see the valley spreading out below them, a patchwork of meadows and timber that looked pristine and untouched from this distance. But somewhere down there, Samuel had discovered something worth killing for. Boone suddenly froze, ears pricked forward, staring at something Elias couldn't see. The dog's hackles rose slowly, and a low growl rumbled in his chest, not the warning bark of a dog encountering wildlife, but the deep, primal sound of an animal sensing mortal danger. Elias dropped to one knee and brought his rifle up, scanning the forest for whatever had triggered Boone's alarm. At first, he saw nothing but trees and shadows, the normal patterns of wilderness that had been his world for 30 years. Then movement caught his eye, a flash of bright orange through the timber, too regular to be natural, too deliberate to be accidental. Hunter's orange. Someone else was up here, moving through the forest with the careful precision of a man who knew exactly where he was going and why. The problem was that hunting season didn't start for another 2 weeks, and this wasn't country that casual hunters would choose anyway. Too remote, too difficult, too far from the comfortable lodges and guided services that most modern hunters preferred. Elias eased back behind a large pine and pulled Boone close, wrapping his arms around the trembling dog. 30 years ago, someone had followed Samuel up this same trail, stalking him like prey through the wilderness that should have been his sanctuary. Now they were back, drawn by some instinct or information that told them the Crowder brothers weren't done asking dangerous questions. The hunter in orange was still moving, working his way up the ridge with the patient persistence of a man who had all the time in the world and no intention of leaving empty-handed. Elias counted at least 2 other figures moving through the timber below, coordinating their approach with military precision. They weren't here for deer or elk. They were here for him. Elias and Boone spent the next hour working their way around the hunters, using every trick Samuel had taught him about moving unseen through familiar country. The old skills came back like muscle memory: where to step to avoid snapping twigs, how to use wind and terrain to mask their scent, when to freeze and when to move. By the time they reached Cache 2, Elias felt like he'd aged another decade, but they'd managed to avoid detection. The second cache was hidden in a rock cairn near an abandoned fire lookout, the kind of remote outpost that had once served as early warning for forest fires, back when the government could afford to staff such places. Samuel had chosen well. The location offered commanding views of the valley below, while providing multiple escape routes through the surrounding timber. Inside the cairn, wrapped in the same oiled leather that had protected everything else, Elias found what Samuel had called the smoking gun, a manila envelope containing photographs that made the earlier pictures look like vacation snapshots. These images showed the mining operation in full swing: dozens of men with industrial equipment, trucks hauling raw ore, and enough environmental destruction to make a conservationist weep. But it was the faces in the photographs that stopped Elias cold. Men he recognized from Cedar Falls, pillars of the community who'd built their reputations on civic service and Christian charity. The mayor's father, the bank president's older brother, and in the center of one group shot, grinning like he'd just won the lottery, was a younger version of Jake Morrison, the land developer who'd been buying up property around Cedar Falls for the past 5 years, always paying cash, always moving fast to close deals before sellers could think twice. Elias had met him a few times in town. Smooth talker, expensive clothes, the kind of handshake that lingered just long enough to make you wonder what he really wanted. Now Elias knew. The photographs were dated 30 years ago, but Morrison couldn't be more than 50 now, which meant he'd been barely 20 when these pictures were taken. Young enough to be learning the family business, old enough to pull a trigger when the situation required it. The apple, as they said, rarely fell far from the tree. Among the photographs was a single Polaroid that made Elias's blood run cold. It showed Samuel crouched behind the same fallen log where Elias had found the compass, photographing the mining operation with a telephoto lens. Someone had been close enough to take his picture without Samuel knowing it, close enough to put a bullet in his back if they'd chosen to. Instead, they'd let him continue gathering evidence, probably hoping he'd lead them to whatever else he'd already hidden. The envelope also contained copies of mining permits and land deeds, all bearing official state seals but clearly falsified. The dates were wrong. The claim numbers didn't match state records, and several of the signatures belonged to officials who'd been dead for years. It was a sophisticated operation that required inside knowledge of the bureaucracy and enough money to buy cooperation at multiple levels. Samuel's notes, written in increasingly desperate handwriting, outlined a conspiracy that reached from the mining site all the way to the state capital. Someone had been systematically looting federal lands for years, using forged documents and intimidation to silence anyone who asked uncomfortable questions. The profits were enormous: millions of dollars in gold and rare earth minerals extracted illegally and sold through legitimate channels. The final item in the cache was a photograph that explained everything. It showed Samuel standing beside a pile of human remains, partially excavated from what looked like a mass grave. His expression was grim, determined, the face of a man who'd finally understood the true scope of what he was investigating. These weren't just environmental criminals. They were killers who'd been disposing of witnesses and competitors for decades. Samuel's note on the back of the photograph was brief and chilling. At least 12 bodies so far. Need federal help, too big for local law. Moving to main site for final evidence. If something happens to me, tell Martha I tried to do the right thing. Elias sat back on his heels, trying to process the magnitude of what his brother had uncovered. Samuel hadn't just stumbled across illegal mining, he'd discovered a criminal enterprise that had been operating for years, maybe decades, killing anyone who got too close to their operation. The young man who'd walked into these mountains 30 years ago had been carrying evidence that could have brought down half the power structure in 3 counties. No wonder they'd killed him. The sound of voices drifting up from the valley below broke Elias from his dark reverie. He crawled to the edge of the lookout platform and peered down through his binoculars, scanning the timber for movement. 3 men in hunter's orange were working their way up the mountain, following what looked like the same game trail Elias and Boone had used. They moved with purpose, checking GPS units and speaking into radio headsets like military personnel on a mission. One of the men looked familiar, tall, silver-haired, expensive gear that screamed weekend warrior with serious money. Through the binoculars, Elias could just make out the face beneath the orange cap. Jake Morrison, looking exactly like his father had 30 years ago, leading a hunting party that wasn't hunting anything with antlers. They'd found his truck at the trailhead, probably had been watching him since he left the cabin. Morrison and his people knew about the vault, knew that Samuel's evidence was finally surfacing after 3 decades underwater. They couldn't afford to let history repeat itself. Couldn't risk another Crowder brother gathering enough evidence to bring down their operation. Elias packed the photographs carefully back into their leather wrapping and tucked the entire cache inside his jacket. Samuel had died trying to get this evidence to the right people. Now it was Elias's responsibility to finish what his brother had started. Assuming he could stay alive long enough to find someone he could trust, the main site was still 5 miles away, deeper into country that offered fewer escape routes and more opportunities for ambush. Going there would be walking directly into Morrison's trap, but Elias knew he had no choice. Samuel's body was probably buried at that location, along with the final pieces of evidence that could put Morrison and his associates behind bars for the rest of their lives. Boone whined softly and pressed against his leg, the old dog's instincts telling him they needed to move soon or risk being cornered. Below them, the hunters were making steady progress up the mountain, their radios crackling with coordinated position reports. "I know, boy," Elias whispered, scratching behind Boone's ears. "Time to go finish what your first master started." They slipped away from the lookout as quietly as they'd arrived, heading deeper into the wilderness that had claimed Samuel Crowder's life and might well claim his brother's before the sun set on another Montana day. The main mining site lay in a hidden valley that didn't appear on any modern map, accessible only through a narrow canyon that Samuel had marked with a simple notation, "God help us all." As Elias worked his way down the treacherous slope, following deer paths and rock ledges that would challenge a mountain goat, he began to understand why his brother had chosen those particular words. The devastation was absolute. What had once been a pristine alpine meadow now looked like the surface of an alien planet, scarred by decades of industrial rape that had torn the heart out of the mountains. Massive pits gouged the earth like wounds that would never heal, their sides streaked with the chemical stains of cyanide leaching and mercury processing. Even from half a mile away, Elias could smell the acrid stench of poisoned earth and poisoned water, but it was the scale of the operation that truly staggered him. This wasn't some weekend prospector panning for gold in a mountain stream. This was industrial mining on a level that required millions of dollars in equipment and infrastructure. Conveyor belts snaked across the valley floor like mechanical serpents, feeding ore into processing plants that hummed with the constant drone of heavy machinery. Trucks the size of houses hauled loads of raw earth toward facilities that looked more like chemical plants than anything belonging in the wilderness. How had they hidden something this massive for so long? The answer came to him as he studied the valley through his binoculars, geography and corruption working hand in hand. The site was invisible from any public road or hiking trail, surrounded by private land that Morrison's family had been quietly acquiring for decades. Anyone who stumbled across it accidentally would have a lot of explaining to do about why they were trespassing on posted property. More importantly, the entire operation was technically legal, according to the forged documents Samuel had found. On paper, Morrison Mining Enterprises held valid permits for everything they were doing, backed by environmental impact studies that existed only in filing cabinets and computer databases. Anyone who tried to investigate would find themselves buried in paperwork and bureaucratic runarounds that could drag on for years. Samuel had figured that out too late. By the time he understood the true scope of the conspiracy, he was already in too deep to simply walk away and pretend he'd never seen anything. Elias found the third cache exactly where Samuel had marked it, hidden in a rock crevice that overlooked the main processing facility. The oiled leather package contained Samuel's final photographs, images that documented not just the mining operation, but its human cost. Bodies stacked like cordwood in what looked like an abandoned mine shaft. Workers who'd asked too many questions or demanded better safety conditions. Environmental activists who'd gotten too close to the truth. Competing prospectors who'd filed claims on land Morrison wanted for himself. The photographs were date-stamped over a period of several years, suggesting that Samuel had been investigating the operation for longer than anyone realized. He'd been patient, methodical, building an airtight case that would have brought down not just Morrison, but an entire network of corrupt officials and silent partners. Among the final pictures was one that made Elias's vision blur with rage and grief. It showed Samuel himself, bound and gagged, kneeling beside what was clearly his own freshly dug grave. His eyes were defiant, even in the face of death, staring directly at the camera with the kind of stubborn courage that had defined the Crowder family for generations. Someone had wanted to document his final moments, probably as insurance against future investigations. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that wasn't Samuel's, someone had written, "This is what happens to people who can't mind their own business." The message was clear. Samuel's death hadn't been the desperate act of criminals covering their tracks. It had been a calculated execution, carried out by people who viewed murder as just another cost of doing business. They'd killed him slowly, probably torturing him for information about what evidence he'd already gathered and where he'd hidden it. That explained why they'd never found Samuel's body. It was buried somewhere in that valley of industrial horror, probably in the same mass grave that held all their other victims. The wilderness that Samuel had loved enough to die for had become his unmarked tomb. Elias forced himself to look through all the photographs, memorizing faces and details that might prove crucial later. If he survived long enough to present this evidence to the right people, every image could be the difference between justice and another cover-up. Samuel had paid for these pictures with his life. The least his brother could do was make sure that sacrifice meant something. The final item in the cache was a gold nugget the size of a chicken egg, smelter marks clearly visible on its surface. Samuel's note explained that he'd found it in the processing facility's waste pile, evidence that Morrison's operation was so profitable they could afford to discard gold that would make most prospectors rich. The nugget also bore serial numbers that could be traced to specific buyers, providing a paper trail that connected the illegal mining directly to legitimate businesses and banks. As Elias studied the nugget, turning it over in his hands like a piece of concentrated guilt, he heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoing off the valley walls. Morrison wasn't taking any chances. He'd called in air support to make sure the second Crowder brother didn't escape to tell his story. Through his binoculars, Elias watched the helicopter circle the valley like a mechanical vulture, its occupants scanning the terrain with military precision. They knew he was here somewhere, knew he'd found Samuel's evidence, and they had every intention of making sure he joined his brother in that unmarked grave. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that Elias was as naive and trusting as Samuel had been 30 years ago, that he'd come alone and unprepared into country where they held every advantage. What they didn't know was that Elias had learned from his brother's death, had spent 3 decades preparing for exactly this moment. Before leaving his cabin, he'd written out a complete account of everything he'd discovered and mailed it to 3 different people: Sheriff Tom Bradley, FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen in Helena, and Martha Henley at the Historical Society. If he didn't return within 72 hours, Martha had instructions to deliver her copy to the nearest federal courthouse and the Montana State Attorney General's office. Morrison could kill him, could make his body disappear into the same wilderness graveyard that held Samuel and all the other inconvenient witnesses. But he couldn't kill the truth anymore. That horse had already left the barn, carrying 30 years of accumulated evidence toward people who had the power and authority to act on it. The helicopter was getting closer, its rotor wash bending the trees as it searched for any sign of the man who carried too many dangerous secrets. Elias packed Samuel's evidence carefully back into his jacket and began working his way toward a position where he could get clear shots of the mining operation. With his own camera, if Morrison wanted to add another Crowder to his collection of buried problems, he was going to have to work for it, and in the process, he might just provide the final piece of evidence needed to bring down an empire built on blood and buried bones. The first rifle shot shattered the mountain silence like breaking glass, the bullet striking rock barely 6 inches from Elias's head and showering him with granite splinters. He rolled behind a boulder as more shots rang out, the professional spacing and precision telling him everything he needed to know about Morrison's hunting party. These weren't weekend warriors playing at being dangerous. They were killers with military training and unlimited ammunition. Boone pressed close against his legs, the old dog trembling but refusing to abandon his master even in the face of gunfire that brought back memories of another terrible day 30 years ago. Through the gaps in the rocks, Elias could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different positions, the shooters coordinating their fire to pin him down while others moved to flank his position. The smart play would be to surrender, to throw down his weapon, and trust that Morrison might prefer to take him alive for questioning about what evidence he'd already shared. But Elias had seen the photographs in Samuel's final cache, had looked into his brother's defiant eyes in that last picture before they'd executed him. There would be no mercy from men who'd built their fortune on unmarked graves and forgotten screams. He counted the seconds between shots, timing the reloads and communication patterns that would give him brief windows to move. The helicopter was still circling overhead, its crew probably directing the ground team through radio headsets and thermal imaging equipment. Every advantage belonged to Morrison's people: numbers, equipment, familiarity with the terrain, and the certainty that no one would come looking for another missing Crowder brother. But Elias had advantages too, earned through 60 years of living in these mountains and 30 years of carrying survivors' guilt. He knew every rock, every tree, every game trail that could provide cover or concealment. More importantly, he had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. The badge fell out of Samuel's jacket when Elias shifted position, landing in the dirt with a metallic clink that seemed impossibly loud, despite the gunfire echoing around them. It was a deputy sheriff's badge, unofficial but real, the kind that federal agents sometimes issued to local cooperators working undercover. Investigations, everything clicked into place with the horrible clarity of puzzle pieces finally finding their proper arrangement. Samuel hadn't been playing amateur detective. He'd been working with federal authorities, probably the FBI or DEA, investigating Morrison's operation as part of a larger case. That explained his systematic approach to gathering evidence, his careful documentation of dates and locations, his confidence that someone would know what to do with the information he was risking his life to collect. It also explained why he'd been killed so brutally. Morrison's people hadn't just eliminated a nosy prospector. They'd executed a federal informant, which meant they were facing life sentences or death penalties if the truth ever came to light. 30 years ago, they'd managed to bury the investigation along with Samuel's body. Now, with Elias carrying the same evidence and asking the same dangerous questions, they had to silence the Crowder family permanently or risk losing everything they'd built on blood and corruption. The shooting stopped abruptly, replaced by the kind of tactical silence that meant the hunters were repositioning for a final assault. Elias used the lull to work his way toward higher ground, following a narrow ledge that offered better defensive positions and multiple escape routes. Boone followed close behind, his wilderness instincts overriding his fear as they moved through terrain that would challenge professional climbers. From his new position, Elias could see the full scope of Morrison's operation laid out below, like a vision of industrial hell. The mining had expanded significantly since Samuel's photographs were taken, with new processing facilities and waste containment areas that suggested decades of continuous operation. Whatever they were extracting from these mountains was valuable enough to justify enormous investment in equipment and infrastructure. The helicopter swept lower, its crew scanning the rocks where Elias had been pinned down moments earlier. Through his rifle scope, he could see Morrison himself in the passenger seat, his face grim with the concentrated fury of a man watching his carefully constructed world begin to collapse. He was speaking rapidly into a radio headset, probably coordinating with teams on the ground and back at company headquarters. Morrison had built an empire on the assumption that he could control every variable, could eliminate every threat before it became dangerous. But empires built on murder and buried secrets always carried the seeds of their own destruction. Samuel had planted those seeds 30 years ago, and now they were finally bearing the fruit of justice. The sound of vehicles approaching from the valley floor drew Elias's attention to a convoy of black SUVs racing toward the mining site. At first, he assumed they were Morrison's reinforcements, additional security personnel called in to clean up the mess that the Crowder brothers had become. Then he saw the government license plates and federal law, enforcement markings that identified them as something else entirely. The FBI had finally arrived. Elias watched through his binoculars as federal agents poured out of the vehicles, their tactical gear and coordinated movements marking them as professionals who'd been planning this operation for longer than Morrison realized. They spread out through the mining facility with the efficient precision of people who knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. Martha Henley had kept her promise. When Elias failed to return within the specified time frame, she delivered his evidence package to the authorities and triggered an investigation that had probably been dormant for 30 years, waiting for someone to provide the final pieces of the puzzle. The helicopter pilot was speaking urgently into his radio, probably warning Morrison that their private war with the Crowder family had just become a federal case. Below them, agents were documenting everything: the mining equipment, the processing facilities, and most importantly, the areas where Samuel's photographs had shown bodies being disposed of in unmarked graves. Morrison's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air, his radio transmissions betraying the kind of panic that comes from watching carefully laid plans dissolve into chaos and catastrophe. He was ordering his people to destroy evidence, to eliminate witnesses, to do whatever was necessary to prevent the truth from reaching a courtroom. But it was too late for damage control. Samuel's evidence was already in federal hands, backed by 30 years of patient investigation and the kind of documentation that could convict an entire criminal organization. The empire built on blood and buried bones was finally crumbling. Brought down by two brothers who'd refused to let sleeping dogs lie, the gunfire resumed as Morrison's people realized they were trapped between federal agents below and an armed witness above. But now they were shooting in desperation rather than coordination, their tactical discipline breaking down as escape routes disappeared and prison sentences became inevitable. Elias kept his rifle ready but held his fire. content to let Morrison's people destroy themselves rather than adding to the violence that had already claimed too many lives in these mountains. Justice was finally coming to the wilderness that had waited 30 years for someone to speak for its buried dead. The voice that called out from the timber behind him was one Elias had heard in his dreams for 30 years, weathered by time and illness, but unmistakably familiar. "Easy there, brother. Don't turn around too fast. These federal boys get nervous when civilians start waving rifles around." Elias froze, his finger still on the trigger, his mind refusing to process what his ears had just told him. It was impossible. Samuel was dead, had been dead for 3 decades, buried somewhere in the valley below, along with all Morrison's other victims. The photographs in the cache had shown his execution, his defiant stare in the face of certain death, but the voice spoke again, closer now, carrying the same gentle humor that had defined Samuel Crowder since boyhood. "I know what you're thinking, Eli. Seen a ghost, heard a dead man talking. But I'm real enough, just a lot older and a lot sicker than I was when we were boys." Slowly, carefully, Elias turned around. The man, standing 20 feet away, bore only passing resemblance to the Samuel Crowder who disappeared into these mountains 30 years ago. His hair was white as fresh snow, his face carved deep with lines of pain and exhaustion. He'd lost maybe 40 pounds, his frame shrunk to skin and bone, beneath clothes that hung like rags on a scarecrow. But the eyes were Samuel's eyes, still bright with intelligence and stubborn courage, despite the cancer that was clearly eating him alive from the inside. "You're dead," Elias whispered, the words feeling strange and hollow on his tongue. "I saw the photograph. They executed you." Samuel smiled, the expression transforming his ravaged features into something that looked almost like the brother Elias remembered. "They executed somebody, all right. But it wasn't me." He moved closer, favoring his left leg, where an old bullet wound had never healed properly. "That poor bastard they killed was a federal agent named David Parks. He looked enough like me in the dark to fool Morrison's boys. At least long enough for me to get away." The pieces of the puzzle began rearranging themselves in Elias's mind, 30 years of assumptions crumbling like a house built on sand. "You've been alive all this time. You let me think. You let everyone think you were dead." "Had to," Samuel said simply. "Parks and I were working together, both of us gathering evidence on Morrison's operation. When they grabbed him instead of me, I had maybe 6 hours before they realized their mistake. 6 hours to disappear so completely that they'd never find me, never threaten anyone I cared about." Samuel pulled a folded letter from his jacket pocket, the paper yellowed with age but carefully preserved. "I wrote this the night I disappeared, planning to mail it once I was safely in witness protection. But the U.S. Marshals said any contact with family would compromise the investigation and put you in danger. So I kept it, carried it for 30 years, waiting for the day I could finally come home." Elias took the letter with hands that shook like autumn leaves. The envelope was addressed to him in Samuel's careful penmanship, postmarked 3 decades ago, but never sent. Inside was a single page that explained everything: the federal investigation, the witness protection program, the impossible choice between family and justice. "I've been living in Oregon," Samuel continued, his voice growing weaker with each word. "Different name, different life, but always watching Morrison's operation through federal contacts. We knew he was still active, still killing people who got too close to his business. But we could never get enough evidence to build a case that would stick." The sound of gunfire from the valley below punctuated his words. Federal agents and Morrison's people engaged in the kind of running battle that had been 30 years in the making. Samuel glanced toward the chaos with the weary expression of a man who'd seen too much violence for one lifetime. "The cancer started last year," he said quietly. "Doctors give me maybe 6 months, probably less. When I heard you'd found the vault, heard Morrison was mobilizing his people to hunt another Crowder brother, I knew it was time to finish what we started." Elias stared at his brother, trying to reconcile the ghost from his nightmares with the dying man standing before him. "Why didn't you contact me sooner? Why wait until now?" Because Morrison's people were still watching you, still hoping you'd lead them to evidence I might have hidden. Every phone call, every piece of mail, every visitor to your cabin, they monitored everything for 30 years, waiting for me to make contact. Samuel's eyes hardened with old anger. They killed my dog to send a message, shot Boone's predecessor, and left him on your porch as a warning about what happens to Crowders who ask too many questions. That explained Boone's fear, his traumatic reaction to certain sounds and scents. The old hound had belonged to Samuel originally, had witnessed his master's apparent death, and somehow made his way back to the cabin, carrying memories too terrible for an animal to process. "The federal agents down there," Elias said, gesturing toward the ongoing battle. "They're here because of the evidence I found?" "Partly. But mostly they're here because I finally contacted them 3 days ago, told them I was ready to come out of hiding and testify." Samuel coughed, bringing up blood that he wiped away with practiced efficiency. "Took them 30 years to build an airtight case, but they've got Morrison dead to rights now. Financial records, witness testimony, enough evidence to put him and his associates away for multiple life sentences. The helicopter was circling lower now, its crew probably trying to extract Morrison before the federal noose tightened completely." Through his binoculars, Elias could see agents moving systematically through the mining facility, photographing everything and marking locations where bodies might be buried. "There's something else," Samuel said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something I couldn't put in any report, couldn't trust to anyone except family." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal box, similar to the vault Elias had found in the river, but newer, still bearing traces of recent burial. "This contains everything: financial records, names of corrupt officials, locations of mass graves, audio recordings of Morrison ordering executions. 30 years of evidence gathered by a dead man who refused to stay buried." Elias took the box, feeling its weight like a physical representation of 3 decades of patient investigation and delayed justice. "Why give it to me? Why not the federal agents?" Samuel's smile was sad and knowing. "Because federal agents retire, get transferred, sometimes get bought off by people with enough money and influence. But family is forever, Eli. Family remembers, and family never stops fighting for what's right." The gunfire below was tapering off as Morrison's people realized their position was hopeless. Soon the federal agents would be climbing toward their position, ready to take Samuel into protective custody and begin the long process of dismantling a criminal empire built on blood and buried secrets. "I'm sorry," Samuel said quietly. "Sorry for letting you think I was dead. Sorry for 30 years of guilt and loneliness. Sorry for everything you've had to carry alone." Elias reached out and gripped his brother's shoulder, feeling the fragile bones beneath skin that was already growing cold. "You did what you had to do. You always did what was right, even when it cost you everything." Below them, the mountains that had hidden Morrison's crimes for 3 decades were finally giving up their secrets to the patient investigation of federal law enforcement. Justice was coming to the wilderness, carried by 2 brothers who'd refused to let the dead stay buried and the guilty go unpunished. But for Elias, the greatest justice was simply having his brother back, even if only for the brief time that remained, before cancer finished what bullets and betrayal had started 30 years ago. The federal agent who climbed up to their position moved like a professional, her tactical gear and confident bearing marking her as someone accustomed to dangerous situations. She kept her weapon lowered but ready, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain for threats, while she approached the 2 brothers with the careful respect due to civilians who'd survived a firefight. "Mr. Crowder," she said, addressing Samuel with the familiarity of long acquaintance. "Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. We spoke on the phone 3 days ago." Samuel nodded weakly, the climb and excitement having drained what little energy his cancer-ravaged body still possessed. "Agent Chen, this is my brother Elias, the one who found the evidence that started this whole mess rolling again." Chen turned to Elias with professional interest. taking in his weathered features and the rifle he still carried with practiced ease. "Mr. Crowder, I want to thank you for the package you left with Martha Henley. Without that evidence, we might never have been able to move on Morrison's operation." "You've been watching him for 30 years, Elias said. "It wasn't a question. Watching, waiting, building a case that would hold up in federal court," Chen confirmed. "Your brother's original evidence was compelling, but not quite enough to guarantee convictions. Morrison had too many legitimate businesses, too many respected community connections, too much political influence to bring down with circumstantial evidence." She gestured toward the valley below, where federal agents were systematically documenting decades of environmental destruction and human rights violations. "But now we have everything. Financial records showing money laundering, environmental reports proving systematic contamination, and most importantly, the locations of mass graves containing victims we've been trying to find for years." Samuel coughed again, the sound wet and painful, bringing up more blood that he tried to hide from his brother's concerned gaze. "How many?" he asked quietly. 23 bodies so far, with ground-penetrating radar indicating at least a dozen more sites. Environmental activists, competing prospectors, federal agents, local officials who asked too many questions. Chen's voice carried the weary anger of someone who'd spent years dealing with institutional murder. Morrison's people kept detailed records. They were proud of their work, documented everything like they were building a trophy collection. The metal box Samuel had given him seemed to grow heavier in Elias's hands as he understood its true significance. This wasn't just evidence of financial crimes or environmental violations. It was a catalogue of genocide, a systematic record of everyone who died to protect Morrison's empire of blood and gold. "There's something else," Chen continued, her expression growing even more grave. "Morrison's not just running when this operation shuts down. Intelligence suggests he's planning to eliminate all remaining witnesses before disappearing into countries that don't extradite to the United States." Samuel struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on a walking stick that Elias now realized was actually a disguised rifle. Even dying, his brother had come prepared for the kind of fight that had been brewing for 30 years. "He knows we're both here. Knows that between Eli's evidence and my testimony, he's looking at multiple death sentences or life without parole, which is why we need to get you both to safety immediately," Chen said. "Morrison's helicopter extracted him about 10 minutes ago, but we have reports of additional armed personnel moving into the area. He's not giving up. He's regrouping for a final assault." Elias looked around at the mountains that had been his home for 3 decades, the wilderness that held so many memories of hunting trips and family conversations and quiet moments of reflection. Morrison's people would turn these peaks into a battleground, would bring violence and death to country that deserve better than human hatred and greed. "No," he said quietly. "We're not running." Both Chen and Samuel stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Eli," his brother said gently, "Morrison's got professional soldiers, military equipment, unlimited funding. This isn't some fair fight between mountain men. This is a war between us and a criminal organization that's been killing people for decades." "Exactly," Elias replied, checking his rifle and counting the ammunition he had remaining. "They've been killing people for decades, including a federal agent who died in your place, and 23 others who just wanted to do the right thing. How many more people have to die before someone makes a stand?" Chen shook her head firmly. "Mr. Crowder, I understand your anger, but this isn't your fight anymore. We have federal jurisdiction, professional personnel, the resources to handle Morrison through proper legal channels. Legal channels that have been compromised for 30 years, Samuel pointed out, his voice growing stronger despite his physical weakness. "Morrison didn't build this empire without help from inside the system. How do you know he doesn't have people in federal law enforcement too?" The question hung in the mountain air like smoke from a distant fire. Chen's expression suggested the possibility had occurred to her as well, that Morrison's influence might extend further into legitimate institutions than anyone wanted to admit. Corruption that deep, that systematic, didn't exist without tentacles reaching into every level of government. Besides, Elias continued, he's not just coming for us. He's coming for everyone who knows the truth. Martha Henley, Sheriff Bradley, anyone who might be able to connect the dots and testify against him. You think he's going to let witnesses scatter to the four winds and hope federal protection keeps them safe? Samuel nodded grimly. Morrison's not the kind of man who leaves loose ends. If he's planning to disappear, he'll clean house first. That means eliminating everyone who poses a threat to his freedom or his fortune. Chen spoke rapidly into her radio, coordinating with other federal teams and requesting additional support. But her expression suggested she was already calculating response times and resources, weighing the likelihood of additional personnel arriving before Morrison's final gambit played out. "How many men does he have?" she asked Samuel. "Last intelligence suggested maybe 24 core personnel, plus whatever additional muscle he can hire on short notice," Samuel replied. "Most of them are ex-military, trained for exactly this kind of operation. They know these mountains as well as we do, and they're equipped for extended combat." Elias studied the terrain around them, his mind automatically cataloguing defensive positions and fields of fire with the instincts of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the wilderness. The federal agents below were professionals, but they were operating in unfamiliar country against opponents who'd had years to prepare for exactly this scenario. "There's a place," he said slowly, "about 2 miles north of here, where the old mining road crosses Granite Creek. Natural choke point, good fields of fire, multiple escape routes if things go bad. If we're going to make a stand, that's where we do it." Samuel studied his brother's face with the keen attention of someone who'd learned to read people's intentions in the subtle details of expression and posture. "You're thinking about more than just survival, aren't you?" "I'm thinking about 30 years of questions that deserve answers," Elias replied. "About a federal agent named David Parks, who died in your place, and 23 other people who trusted the system to protect them. About making sure Morrison pays for every life he's destroyed, every family he's torn apart." Chen looked between the two brothers, seeing something in their shared determination that probably reminded her why she'd become a federal agent in the first place. Sometimes justice couldn't wait for proper procedures and bureaucratic approval. Sometimes it required ordinary people to stand up and fight for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. "If we do this," she said finally, "we do it right. Coordinated defense, proper communications, civilian safety as the primary objective." She keyed her radio again, speaking in the coded language of federal tactical operations. "And we make damn sure Morrison doesn't walk away from this mountain alive." The sun was beginning to set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed appropriate for the blood that was about to be spilled in these ancient mountains. Somewhere out there, Morrison and his army of killers were preparing for their final assault. Confident that they could eliminate the last witnesses to 30 years of systematic murder, they were about to discover that the Crowder brothers had learned a few things about warfare during their decades in the wilderness. And this time, they weren't fighting alone. The attack came at dawn, just as Elias had predicted it would. Morrison's people moved through the pre-dawn darkness like ghosts, their night vision equipment and suppressed weapons giving them every tactical advantage. Except the most important one. They didn't know the ground like men who'd been born to it. Elias lay behind a fallen log at the creek crossing, his rifle trained on the narrow bridge that offered the only vehicle access to their defensive position. Beside him, Samuel clutched his disguised walking stick, the hidden rifle mechanism ready despite hands that shook with illness and exhaustion. Agent Chen had positioned herself with 2 other federal agents in overlapping fields of fire, their professional equipment a stark contrast to the Crowder brothers' hunting rifles and mountain man tactics. The first shot came from Morrison himself, firing from the helicopter that swooped low over the creek bed like a mechanical hawk. The bullet struck inches from Elias's head, showering him with bark and splinters as he rolled deeper into cover. More shots followed from positions scattered through the timber. At least a dozen shooters coordinating their fire with military precision, but precision meant nothing when your targets knew every rock and tree in a 5-mile radius. Elias had spent 30 years walking these mountains, memorizing every game trail and water source and natural fortification. Morrison's professional killers were operating in his backyard now. Fighting on ground he could navigate blindfolded. Samuel's first shot dropped one of Morrison's men from a pine tree 50 yards away, the body falling through the branches with a crash that seemed to echo forever in the mountain silence. His brother might be dying, but his marksmanship was still deadly accurate after 3 decades of forced retirement. "Recording device," Samuel gasped, pulling a small digital recorder from his jacket pocket. Morrison's father got him to confess to the original murders back in '94, thought the old man was senile, that nobody would believe him anyway. Elias took the device with hands steady as granite despite the bullets whining overhead. Morrison's empire had been built on the assumption that dead men tell no tales, that witnesses could be silenced and evidence could be buried. But the past had a way of surfacing at the worst possible moments, like chains pulled from river bottoms by faithful dogs who remembered everything. The helicopter made another pass, its door gunner spraying automatic fire across their position with the kind of wasteful aggression that suggested panic rather than tactical thinking. Morrison was losing control of the situation, watching his carefully planned cleanup operation dissolve into the kind of public firefight that would bring federal attention from every agency in the region. "Agent," Chen's voice crackled through the radio headset she'd given. "In this, additional support is 20 minutes out, 2 FBI tactical teams and a Montana State Police helicopter. Can you hold that long?" 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours, with Morrison's people closing in from 3 sides. Elias could see muzzle flashes from positions that were getting progressively closer. The shooters using covering fire to advance by bounds through terrain that offered plenty of concealment for anyone who knew how to use it. "Boone," Samuel whispered, pointing toward a cluster of rocks where Morrison's men were establishing a flanking position. "Send him around the long way. He knows the ground, knows how to move without being seen." Elias looked at the old hound, seeing intelligence and determination in eyes that had witnessed too much violence for one animal's lifetime. Boone had survived Samuel's apparent death, had carried traumatic memories for 30 years, had led his second master to the truth that was finally setting them all free. Now he had one more job to do, one final service to the men who'd given him purpose and love, and a reason to keep fighting. "Go get them." "Boy," Elias whispered, scratching behind Boone's ears one last time. "Finish what we started." The dog disappeared into the timber like smoke, his grey coat blending perfectly with the shadows, and his wilderness instincts guiding him along paths that no human tracker could follow. Within minutes, shouts of confusion erupted from the flanking position as Boone began his own private war against the men who'd destroyed his first master's life. Morrison's voice echoed across the canyon, amplified by a bullhorn from the helicopter. "Crowder! Both of you. This ends now. Surrender and maybe I'll make it quick." Samuel laughed, the sound wet with blood but filled with genuine amusement. 30 years too late for that conversation, Morrison. Should have killed me when you had the chance." The response was immediate and violent, concentrated fire from every position, bullets chewing through wood and rock with the steady rhythm of men who had unlimited ammunition and limited time. But the brothers had chosen their position well, using natural rock formations and fallen timber to create overlapping fields of cover that could absorb tremendous punishment. Elias spotted Morrison in the helicopter's passenger seat, his expensive hunting clothes and perfectly groomed appearance marking him as someone who'd never expected to get his hands dirty with the actual killing. He'd built his empire by hiring others to do the violence, staying clean while his employees did the necessary wet work that kept his operation running smoothly. But empires, built on other people's blood, always collapsed when the hired killers ran out of motivation to keep fighting. Morrison's men were professionals, but they were also human beings with families and futures that didn't include dying in Montana. Mountains to protect a boss who viewed them as expendable. Resources. The tide began to turn when Boone's harassment of the flanking team created an opening that Agent Chen exploited with ruthless efficiency. Her tactical training and federal equipment allowed her to advance through positions that Morrison's men had considered secure, eliminating threats with precision shooting that would have impressed any military instructor. Samuel's recording device lay between the brothers like a technological time bomb, containing 30 years of accumulated confessions and evidence that could destroy not just Morrison, but an entire network of corruption that reached into legitimate businesses and government agencies. Morrison knew it existed, knew that his father's senile rambling had provided the final piece of evidence needed to connect him to murders dating back decades. The helicopter was circling lower now, Morrison probably preparing to extract his remaining people before federal reinforcements arrived. But Elias could see the desperation in the aircraft's flight pattern, the kind of erratic movement that suggested a pilot operating under extreme stress and impossible orders. "He's going to run," Samuel said, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "Going to cut his losses and disappear before the net closes completely." Elias raised his rifle, tracking the helicopter's movement with the patient precision of a hunter who'd learned to wait for the perfect shot. Morrison had built his fortune on the assumption that he could always buy his way out of consequences, could always hire someone else to clean up his messes and eliminate his problems. But some problems couldn't be solved with money or violence or the kind of institutional corruption that had protected Morrison's operation for 30 years. Some problems required justice, the kind that came from mountain men who'd learned patience from the wilderness and determination from the bones of buried brothers. Elias's shot took out the helicopter's tail rotor at 200 yards, sending the aircraft into a spinning descent that ended with a bone-jarring crash in the creek bed 50 feet from their position. Morrison crawled from the wreckage with blood streaming from a head wound, his expensive hunting gear torn and muddy, his perfectly groomed appearance finally matching the ugliness of his soul. The crash had broken more than just machinery. It had broken the morale of Morrison's remaining men, who suddenly found themselves fighting for a boss who couldn't guarantee their extraction or their payment. One by one, they began withdrawing from their positions, slipping away through the timber like shadows fleeing the dawn. But Morrison himself wasn't finished. He struggled to his feet beside the burning helicopter, clutching a pistol in hands that shook with rage and desperation. Through the smoke and flame, his eyes locked onto Samuel with the kind of hatred that had been festering for 30 years. "You should have stayed dead, Crowder," Morrison screamed, his voice cracking with the strain of a man watching his empire crumble. "You and your whole worthless family should have stayed buried." Samuel pushed himself upright against the fallen log, his wedding ring catching the morning sunlight as he raised his disguised rifle. The simple gold band had never left his finger, despite 30 years of assumed death, 30 years of living under false names in witness protection. Some bonds were stronger than death, stronger than fear, stronger than the kind of corruption that reduced human beings to entries in a ledger book. "Maybe," Samuel replied, his voice carrying clearly across the creek bed. "But we didn't, and now you get to pay for every life you've destroyed, every family you've torn apart, every grave you've filled with innocent people who just wanted to do what was right." Morrison raised his pistol, his movements clumsy with injury and desperation. But before he could fire, Boone emerged from the timber like an avenging spirit, his grey coat singed by helicopter fuel, but his old bones still carrying him at a speed that would have impressed hunters half his age. The dog hit Morrison low and hard, knocking him backward into the creek, where the current grabbed his expensive clothes and began dragging him downstream toward deeper water. Morrison thrashed and fought, trying to bring his weapon to bear on the animal that had become the instrument of his destruction. But Boone wasn't attacking, he was retrieving, performing the same function he'd been trained for as a young dog decades earlier. Instead of bringing back a downed bird, he was dragging a wounded criminal toward the men who'd spent 30 years waiting for justice to finally arrive in these mountains. Agent Chen and her team moved in quickly, securing Morrison and applying medical aid that probably saved his life. Federal agents read him his rights, while paramedics worked to stabilize his injuries, the bureaucratic machinery of justice finally engaging after 3 decades of patience and preparation. "Samuel's recording," Morrison gasped, his eyes finding Elias through the crowd of federal personnel. "My father was senile. That confession won't hold up in court. You've got nothing that connects me directly to any of the killings." Samuel smiled from his position beside the fallen log, his face gray with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a job finally completed. "Maybe not, but we've got something better." He pulled a second device from his jacket, this one smaller and more sophisticated than the voice recorder. GPS tracker, military grade. Been documenting every location where bodies are buried, every site where your people disposed of evidence. 30 years of coordinates, timestamps, and photographic documentation. Morrison's face went white as he understood the implications. Even if individual pieces of evidence could be challenged in court, the sheer volume of documentation would be overwhelming. Financial records, witness testimony, physical evidence, and now precise locations for mass graves that contained decades of Morrison's victims. More importantly, Agent Chen added, checking her tactical radio, "We've got your entire organization." Financial analysis traced money laundering through 17 different businesses. Wiretaps recorded planning sessions for 6 different murders. And forensic accounting identified profits from illegal mining going back to the 1980s. The sound of additional helicopters approaching from the south marked the arrival of federal reinforcements, but the battle was already over. Morrison's private army had melted away into the mountains, leaving their employer to face the consequences of a criminal enterprise that had finally collapsed under its own weight. Samuel coughed again, bringing up blood that was getting darker and more frequent as his body surrendered to the cancer that was eating him alive from the inside. But his expression was peaceful, satisfied in a way that Elias hadn't seen since they were young men hunting these same mountains with their father. "Eli," he whispered, pulling off his wedding ring with fingers that could barely grip the simple gold band. "Give this to Martha. Tell her I never stopped loving her, never stopped thinking about the life we could have had together." Elias took the ring, feeling its warmth like a physical manifestation of 30 years of love and longing and sacrifice. Samuel had given up everything, his family, his identity, his chance at happiness, to ensure that justice would eventually find its way to these mountains. "She knows," Elias said quietly. "She's always known. Kept your picture on her desk at the school. Kept fresh flowers on what she thought was your grave. Love like that doesn't die just because the government says someone has to disappear." Samuel nodded, his eyes drifting closed as medical personnel began working to stabilize his condition for transport to the nearest hospital. The cancer would probably kill him within months, but he'd lived long enough to see Morrison's empire destroyed and his victims' stories finally told. Morrison was loaded onto a medical helicopter, his wrist secured with federal restraints that would keep him in custody for the rest of his natural life. As the aircraft lifted off, carrying him toward a prison cell that would be his final address, he stared down at the mountains that had hidden his crimes for 30 years and finally given them up to the patient investigation of men who understood that some debts could never be forgiven. Boone limped over to where the brothers lay side by side, his gray muzzle nuzzling Samuel's hand with the devotion of a creature who'd never forgotten his first master, despite 3 decades of separation. The old dog's work was finally finished. His long vigil over the Crowder family's secrets finally ended with the kind of justice that made all the waiting and suffering worthwhile. Federal agents continued documenting the crime scene, marking evidence and recording testimony that would fuel prosecutions for years to come. But for Elias, the most important victory was simply having his brother back, even if only for the brief time that remained before cancer finished what bullets and betrayal had started so long ago. The mountains stood silent around them, ancient and patient as always, holding their memories of violence and redemption with the same indifference they'd shown to countless human dramas over the millennia. But today, justice had finally come to the wilderness, carried by two brothers and a faithful dog who'd refused to let the dead stay buried and the guilty go unpunished. 6 months later, Elias stood beside a simple granite headstone in Cedar Falls Cemetery, reading the inscription that finally told the truth about Samuel Crowder's life and death. The marker bore both names, the one he'd been born with and the one he'd lived under in witness protection, along with dates that acknowledged 30 years of sacrifice. For the cause of justice, Martha Henley stood beside him, her graying hair catching the spring sunlight as she placed fresh wildflowers at the base of the stone. She wore Samuel's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, the simple gold band that had traveled through decades of separation and deception to finally find its way home. "He was proud of you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent Samuel's final weeks at his hospital bedside. "Talked about his big brother constantly, about how you'd never given up searching for the truth even when everyone else accepted that he was dead." Elias nodded, his throat tight with emotions that had taken months to process. Samuel had lived long enough to see Morrison convicted on multiple counts of murder and racketeering, long enough to provide testimony that brought down an entire network of corruption, reaching from local businesses all the way to state government. He died knowing that his sacrifice had meaning, that the 30 years of separation from everything he loved had finally produced the justice he'd spent his life pursuing. The cemetery was quiet, except for the sound of wind through the pine trees that surrounded the small community like protective guardians. Many of the graves held people who'd been touched by Morrison's operation in one way or another. Environmental activists who'd asked too many questions, prospectors who'd filed competing claims, federal agents who'd gotten too close to the truth. Now they rested in peace, their stories finally told, and their deaths finally avenged. Boone lay in the shade of Samuel's headstone, his grey muzzle resting on paws that had carried him through more adventures than most dogs could imagine. The old hound was visibly failing, his 13-year-old body finally surrendering to the accumulated weight of age and trauma. But he'd lived long enough to see his masters reunited, long enough to help finish the job that had defined his entire existence. "He knows," Martha said, following Elias's gaze to the sleeping dog. "Animals understand these things better than we do sometimes. He knows Samuel is finally at peace, knows his job is done." Sheriff Tom Bradley approached across the cemetery grass, his uniform pressed and his expression carrying the weight of someone who'd spent months dealing with the fallout from Morrison's crimes. The federal investigation had uncovered corruption in his own department, deputies who'd been paid to look the other way, evidence that had been buried or destroyed, reports that had been filed but never investigated. "Federal prosecutors want to interview you again next week," Bradley said, his voice respectful. "Morrison's lawyers are trying to get some of the evidence thrown out, claiming it was obtained illegally when you entered the mining site without proper authorization." Elias smiled grimly. Morrison's legal team was expensive and creative, but they were fighting a losing battle against 30 years of accumulated evidence and witness testimony. The man who'd built his empire on buried secrets was discovering that federal prosecutors could be just as patient and methodical as the criminals they pursued. "Let them try," Elias replied. "Every grave they excavate, every victim they identify, every financial record they trace, it all leads back to Morrison. He can hire all the lawyers he wants, but the dead don't lie. The investigation was still ongoing, with teams of federal agents and forensic specialists working to identify remains and trace the full extent of Morrison's criminal enterprise. The mining site had been closed and designated as a federal crime scene. The environmental damage so extensive that cleanup efforts would continue for decades. But the most important work had already been completed. 29 bodies had been identified and returned to their families for proper burial. Corrupt officials had been arrested and prosecuted. Financial assets had been seized and distributed to victims' families as compensation for decades of pain and loss. Martha checked her watch, her expression growing apologetic. "I need to get back to the school. Spring parent conferences start in an hour." She touched Samuel's headstone one final time, her fingers tracing the carved letters of his name. He would have been 60 this December. "We were going to travel, maybe see the ocean." He always talked about seeing the Pacific, watching the sun set over water instead of mountains. Elias watched her walk away, this woman who'd waited 1 year for Samuel to return and then built a good life while keeping his memory alive in her heart. She'd never remarried, had channeled her maternal instincts into teaching other people's children and preserving the history of a community that had been built on both dreams and nightmares. Sheriff Bradley lingered beside the grave, his expression thoughtful. "My father always suspected Samuel was working with federal agents. Never said anything official, but he used to wonder why the FBI was so interested in what looked like a simple missing person case." "Your father was a good man," Elias replied. "He did what he could with the resources he had and the pressure he was under." "Can't ask for more than that." Bradley nodded, understanding the forgiveness that came with finally knowing the whole truth. "Morrison's sentencing is scheduled for next month. Federal judge is talking about multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. He'll die in prison, which is more mercy than he showed his victims." The sound of a car door closing drew their attention to Agent Chen, who was walking across the cemetery with the measured pace of someone accustomed to bringing difficult news to grieving families. She'd been promoted following the successful conclusion of the Morrison investigation, her patient work over 3 decades finally receiving the recognition it deserved. "Mr. Crowder," she said, addressing Elias with the professional courtesy that had marked all their interactions. "I wanted to thank you personally for everything you and your brother did to make this case possible. Without your courage and persistence, Morrison would still be operating and more people would have died." She handed him a small wooden box, polished and engraved with the FBI seal. "This contains your brother's commendation for distinguished service. It's normally presented to active agents, but the director made an exception given the extraordinary circumstances of Samuel's contribution to federal law enforcement." Inside the box was a medal that recognized 30 years of sacrifice and service, along with a letter from the FBI director acknowledging Samuel's role in dismantling one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in Montana history. It was official recognition of what the Crowder family had always known, that Samuel had died a hero, even when the world thought he was just another missing prospector. "There's something else," Chen continued. "The federal government is establishing a victim compensation fund using assets seized from Morrison's organization. Your brother's estate will receive a substantial settlement, which I believe he intended to leave to local charities and the families of other victims." Elias nodded, unsurprised by Samuel's final act of generosity. His brother had never fought for money or recognition. He'd fought because it was the right thing to do. Because someone had to stand up for people who couldn't protect themselves from the kind of institutional evil that Morrison represented. As the others departed, Elias found himself alone in the cemetery with Boone, 2 old survivors who'd outlasted their enemies through sheer stubbornness and the kind of loyalty that didn't recognize defeat. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers that had defined his life in these mountains. "Come on." "Boy," he said to the old dog, who stirred reluctantly from his nap beside Samuel's grave. "Time to head home." They walked slowly through the cemetery, past graves that told the story of a community that had endured boom and bust, prosperity and corruption, loss and redemption. Cedar Falls would survive Morrison's legacy just as it had survived everything else: forest fires and economic collapse, environmental destruction and human greed. The mountains endured because they were patient, because they understood that human dramas were temporary things, measured in decades, while the wilderness measured time in geological epochs. But sometimes, when the right people made the right choices at the right moments, those temporary human dramas could create something lasting: justice that echoed through generations, truth that outlasted the lies built to bury it. Elias's truck was parked outside the cemetery gates, loaded with supplies for another week alone in the cabin that had been his sanctuary for 30 years. But solitude felt different now, less like exile and more like choice. He had work to do, maintaining Samuel's grave, preserving his brother's memory, serving as a witness to the kind of truth that powerful people preferred to keep buried. Boone settled onto the passenger seat with a contented sigh, his old bones finally able to rest now that his long vigil was over. Through the windshield, the Bitterroot Mountains stretched toward a horizon that promised another sunset, another sunrise, another day of quiet redemption in the wilderness that had tested two brothers and found them worthy of the legacy they'd inherited from their father and grandfather. The truck climbed the familiar road toward home, carrying an old man and an older dog toward whatever peace could be found in mountains that had finally given up their darkest secrets to the patient investigation of family love and stubborn justice. Behind them, Samuel Crowder rested under Montana soil, his story finally told, his sacrifice finally recognized, his faith in his big brother finally vindicated by the kind of truth that no amount of money or power could ever completely bury. In the distance, thunder rumbled over the peaks, not the sound of approaching storms, but the echo of ancient promises kept and debts finally paid in full.